1507, Waldseemüller created a map that has been termed the birth certificate of America, for it is where the name America first appeared. There were 1,000 copies of the map made at the time, but they were quickly lost. For centuries, scholars had been trying to find an original copy of this map, and it wasn't until 1906 that Father Joseph Fisher found a copy in his collection. It took a century. In 2003, the Library of Congress purchased it for the United States of America for $10 million. And it is a copy of that map that we will first look at today. Welcome to Tingledom. Hello all. I am so excited to do this 7 days of maps with you. This series is just you and me. No one else. I'm not doing a day full of sessions. These are just going to be individually between you and me. I wanted to do this with you because I have felt how much you love when we do the maps. And so I wanted to be able to share a bit extra. Each day we'll be going through a century of maps. Friday and Saturday will split to the 20th century, so we'll have 1900 to 1949 on Friday, and then 1950 to 1999 on Saturday. And of course, finally, the 2000s on Sunday. I have between 2 and 4 maps for us each day. It's been very hard to narrow down, but I want to be able to go in depth with each map that we look at. The focus will primarily be large-scale maps, so looking at the continent as a whole, with a few notable exceptions. Let's get started. Our first map is highly significant, especially as this is the origin of the name America. This is the 1507 Waldseemüller Map. It's given the nickname as the birth certificate of America, but we'll get into that. The full title is Universalis Cosmographica Secundum Ptolemy Traditionum et Americi Vespucci Allorum que Illustrationes. We have a very small version here to make it manageable to see the whole thing. Its original size was 1.4 meters by 2.4 meters. Very, very massive. And it was the result of a confluence of events. It bears Waldseemüller's name, but it was because of access to a lot of different people, even down to what some term the rediscovery of Ptolemy's Geographica. And we see this influence in Europe they had more accurately mapped Europe by this time, but this is influenced by how Ptolemy had mapped it over 1,000 years earlier. But we also have the influence of Atlantic explorers going off from Spain and Portugal, and the Italians who were funding and going on these expeditions. And Waldseemüller, as you may be able to guess, is German, and the Germans were in the middle, and they were seeing all the advances in printing with the printing press. And it was for these reasons that we probably see this from Waldseemüller. It's because he was at the middle of these events. And he and Wingman did most of the writing associated with this project. Now, as I mentioned, if we look right down here, this is the first time that the name America is used to refer to this new area. Now, Waldseemüller's intention wasn't that the whole continent would be named America, but rather that this particular part of what would be modern-day Brazil would be called America. Now, they've also given an explanation saying that Amerigo Vespucci discovered it, and because the other continents, Africa, Asia, and Europa, because those are all feminine names, they suggested that America should be feminine as well. Now, the reason he believed that America was the first one to discover in the European sense, not obviously the first human to set foot on there or live or understand the land. But the reason he believed that at the time was because of the Soderini letter. There was contention at the time, and there's still actually contention today. It's not really settled among historians who actually, among Europeans, explored America first. Because while Columbus landed in the Caribbean first, it wasn't until a few years later that he actually stepped onto the continent. And Amerigo Vespucci then had a letter that he had sent to Soderini, which discussed landing on America before Christopher Columbus's date. And Waldseemüller believed the authenticity of that letter. But historians today aren't sure about how accurate that letter actually is. This was created on a wood block printing press, while movable type and everything like that had been invented and was being used quite extensively in Germany at this time for imagery and like this. It's still more common to see woodblock printing, because then you were able to carve all the details into the wood and the like. Don't see metal engraving until a bit later. the significance of this map is not just America. It represents a shift in perspective. And we'll focus in on these two panels to illustrate this. We see a mini version of the world, common to ones that might have been done before. And we see two figures then looking down over our larger version of the world. And for modern eyes, this doesn't seem that significant. We've got America Vespucci, and we've got Ptolemy over here. And you can see he's carrying his book, indicating the Geographica. Very significant in cartography. But what you have to understand is previous to this time, there was a tradition of mappamundi, which were maps of the world, and at the top would always be God looking down on the world. Whereas here we see two men, just men of the world, placed in this position. And so this position is indicating that man can discover the world, and man can own the world. It feeds into that higher level of Eurocentricity that we see in the attitudes of the time there. The other significant convention that we see in this map that shifts is the placement of north at the top, which really brings Europe into the center. It had been a previous convention to place east at the top. And so this shift really does bring into focus the Eurocentricity and the focus on Europe of being the center of the world. Now, to look into Waldseemüller himself, he lived from 1470 and died on the 16th of March, 1520. He was the son of a butcher and attended the University of Freiburg starting in 1490. The same time as this map, he also created a smaller and simplified globe, which also helps dispel the myth that anybody thought that the world was flat around that time. Now, as I mentioned before, Waldseemüller's intention was only to name this particular area America. It was the adoption of the name by other cartographers in later maps that really spread the name. By 1538 in Mercator's map, you can see the name given to both North and South America, but it does all emerge from this singular map. The parts of North America that we see are a little bit of Florida. We obviously see the Caribbean. The Caribbean is fairly well mapped compared to the rest of the Americas. And we see this northeast coast of South America. It's an interesting map as well because it shows a separation between North and South America. His next map, which came in 1516, does show a connection. Even though there weren't well-published reports about any explorations of that area. So conjecture from historians is that the Portuguese were perhaps departing from their lane and exploring the other side here, which is also why they know that there's ocean here. And then that information about the Isthmus of Panama had filtered back by the 1516 version of the map. But that's conjecture, so it's not sure, but it's most definitively not showing as connected to Asia. They know that this is a separate land, not part of Asia. Interestingly enough, in that next version, in the 1516 version, he did not use the term America at all, calling North America Terra de Cuba Asiae Partis, as in a part of Asia, interestingly enough. In North America here we see the Terra del Terra Incognita, the unknown land. It really was unknown. A very significant period of time this time. And while a lot of the actions that preceded and followed this map were atrocious in many instances, it's without a doubt still very significant to the events that unfolded. Our next map today comes from 1562, the Gutiérrez Map. America sive corte orbis parte nove et exactissima descriptio. And we see North America in much more detail. And this is just a half century later, so about 50 years later. And we see a connection with the Isthmus of Panama. It comes from 6 engraved sheets, and the original size was 93 centimeters by 86 centimeters. The largest Spanish map of America before the end of the 1700s. Now, Gutiérrez himself was a cosmographer at the Casa de la Contratación and received a royal appointment on the 22nd of October 1554, 8 years before the production of this map. The engraver of this map is Hieronymus Koch, and he was working in Antwerp. And very common to see maps coming out of Antwerp because the engraving was much more sophisticated there. Spanish engravers would not have been able to produce such a map, so it was exported. What's interesting about this map, we see Tropic of Capricorn, the Tropic of Cancer, but there's no line of demarcation. And for a Spanish Spanish map at the time, the line of demarcation was rather significant between the Portuguese and the Spanish as to who got what part of the world, according to the Pope, of course. And so we don't see this. Not sure why exactly. There's no other mention really of that, but it is quite noticeable that it's absent. Now down here, we see the first recorded appearance of the name California. And here we see the first appearance of the word Appalachian, or Appalachian, to refer to these mountains. But part of what I love about maps of this time are the beautiful embellishments that we see. The ships in the ocean and the shipwrecks close to land. These fearsome sea monsters and mermen. Just so many ships going around. It's fanciful and fancy. I do love the way it enlivens and broadens the mind, if not being obviously the most accurate. And we see some elephants and lion and rhinoceros in the map. And of course I do love these gorgeous embellishments, but probably one of my favorites is just these simple but beautiful and elegant mountains. And that's, through all of time, one of my favorite mapping features. And I do think it's a shame we don't use these a bit more in our modern maps. They're beautiful and also illustrative of what they are. And it is a very special map. Now we see the Gulf of Mexico, called Golfo de la Nueva España. And for the ocean, we see Oceanos Septentrionales, meaning ocean of the North Ocean. We have Mar del Sur, or Mar del Sur, sorry. And down here we have Oceanus Australis. We have Tierra Francisca, Moscava, Florida. See the name Florida on here. This silhouette here would look somewhat familiar to us. Not the most accurate, but it's there. I also love this texture in the water. Probably see that more likely for mountains nowadays, but I love that wavy texture. It's beautiful. Lovely. We've just gotten our very first hints of the mapping of North America. And there's a lot of tragedy and arrogance which influences the events of this time. It is without a doubt very significant in this time period for the world, and has a huge influence to today. For me, I also really appreciate the gorgeous intersection of art and cartography. The fanciful and beautiful and mythical combined with spatial knowledge is something truly remarkable at this time, which we'll see further examples